I have to say that I'm quite embarrassed that I spent so long of my life contributing to this kind of stuff without really giving it a proper second thought. I'm often asked if I judge people who continue to purchase animal products, and I have to say that there's only one person I can legitimately judge in that regard, and it's my former self. Having spent 20 years of my life contributing to this industry, I consider what I'm doing now, this kind of stuff, as a way of making up for it, as a way of trying to find a way to forgive myself, because God knows that if the animals that I was responsible for torturing, killing, and abusing were given the opportunity, they sure as hell wouldn't forgive me. So that's why I'm here today, right? Because one glance, a single glance at the cages, at the gas chambers, at the rape racks, at the macerators, one glance at all of this immediately shattered any illusions that I was harboring about animal welfare. And I immediately realized that this is an issue that demands attention. And that's why, despite only ever having wanted to just talk about philosophy of religion on YouTube, I now stand before you today as an animal rights advocate, a line of work that I never ever thought that I would be getting into, but now one that I can't imagine my life without, as a person who was discussing the philosophy of religion, debating the religious. And I was sometimes dealing with people who would blindly follow their faith into some of the most evil and irrational of doctrines and behaviors. I was no stranger to irrationality, to people living in denial, to faith-based thinking, but I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, that despite my years of arguing with religious fanatics and dogmatic Christian nationalists and would-be theocrats, I have genuinely never witnessed more dogma, more ignorance, more evil, right, more faith-based thinking, and indeed I might even say more religiosity than I've ever seen when I started talking about animal rights. I mean, the Christian right wing doesn't even come close in terms of the kind of dogma and ignorance that we're dealing with. And the faith-based thinking, the following blindly, just doing what you think is right because you're just essentially a slave to your traditions. This, if I'm honest, the reactions that I was receiving, these kinds of reactions, only made me want to talk about it more. A lot of people weren't very happy with this shift when I started talking about this. I mean, first this kid comes for the creator of the heavens and the earth, the Alpha and the Omega, and as if that wasn't bad enough, now he wants me to give up eating bacon too. Well, yes, I'm afraid to say. Because this point isn't just one of philosophical musing, this is more a point of duty. And in fact, the most basic duty, and the most self-evident duty that we can possibly have as ethical beings, that's to avoid inflicting suffering where it can be avoided. A quote attributed to Carl Sagan that is very commonly repeated among the atheist skeptic community is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It's a favorite among skeptics, you'll have heard it all the time. Some people call it Hitchens' razor because of how he liked to employ the term. I would like to humbly add to this great tradition by suggesting a razor of my own, that extraordinary harm and mistreatment requires extraordinary justification. This seems at least as true to me as Carl Sagan's pithy maxim, and yet when reflecting on the treatment of animals, it's not just the case that we don't have extraordinary justification for extraordinary harms. We don't even have ordinary justifications, even for the most basic mistreatment of animals that we currently partake in. Not enough time is spent reflecting on the fact that in the normal course of human ethical intuition, the more innocent the victim, the more we think they require and deserve our attention and special moral concern. Right? That seems obvious, right? It's worse for me to smack a baby than to smack an adult, because one is so much more innocent than the other. But once you cross the species boundary, this intuition seems to be exactly reversed. Now, the more defenseless, the more innocent, the more domitable the being, the more we feel we have a right to abuse them. When it comes to torture, think about this. When you hear about this as a method of war or something like this, we don't justify torturing our enemies, even when we have a good reason to do it. And yet we do justify torturing the most innocent members of our moral community. And the worst thing, that those who are paying for this don't think they need to give an explanation at all. You are demonstrating that you implicitly accept an ideology that says that you have the ethical warrant to harm an animal for the sake of your taste pleasure. Now, say what you like about that kind of belief, but don't tell me that's the neutral position. Don't tell me that we're the ones with the ideology for wishing for this to end. That's not how it works. When I refuse to kill another human being, I'm not doing something affirmative. I'm refraining from doing something. And when I refuse to kill another animal, I'm not doing something from these people that they seem to not like when people force their opinions on others. I take them a lot more seriously, I have to say, if they would stop forcing their opinions upon animals, right? That would make me take them a lot more seriously. I wish someone had the gall to say to me before I was vegan a few years ago. Let me put it plainly. If you have the right to force a pig into a gas chamber, then you can be damn sure I have the right to force you into a conversation about your justification for doing so. I want to speak about why, as an atheist, I began to feel a true affinity with the vegan community. Surprisingly, the debate around veganism and the debate about religion actually have some interesting parallels. As I briefly mentioned, I don't think I mentioned, atheism is not a thing that people do, right? It's a thing that people don't do. And yet, historically, atheism has been called radical, extreme, insensitive to important traditions, inconvenient, just something a bunch of kind of young radicals get together and blindly follow. Sound familiar? Well, when I first heard that veganism has a reputation for these things too, I began to hear the echoes of people who'd been saying this about atheists for centuries, and for the whole time been talking out of there are children here. Their digestive system appears to be working in reverse. Put it that way. Whilst religion is a faith-based pursuit, based in wishful thinking and the desire for supernatural consolation, it takes absolutely no faith, none, to recognize the undeniable truth of animal suffering, and believe me, it doesn't provide any consolation. At least for the religious, the concept of hell, as disgusting and threatening a concept that it is something that already exists. Right? It's already there. God made it. It's not their fault that hell exists. And we only experience it after we're dead. And even all of this is based on, shall we say, tentative evidence, right? Animal farming, conversely, creates hell where it didn't exist before, and doesn't just use it as a threat for bad behavior, but proactively breeds beings into existence just to experience it for the entirety of their life. And where the religious, in my view, don't have nearly enough evidence to support the claim that their hell actually exists, and could do with a lot more of it, factory farms have the exact opposite problem of having an overwhelming amount of evidence that their hell on earth does truly exist. As my friend Steve Woodford once said to me, if you were the devil and you were trying to create the worst possible experience for animals just for the sake of suffering itself, you actually couldn't do much better than what we're already doing to them on factory farms. And suppress this evidence they do, right? Or at least they try their best. We're all familiar with the propaganda that we see flooding our supermarket aisles, free range, happy cows, all of this kind of stuff, which is, of course, nothing more than a fantasy. You can stick a free range label on chickens that are housed, or on eggs that come from chickens that are housed in barns at a density of 9 chickens per square meter, and whose male populations have been massacred at birth because they won't produce any eggs. But don't worry, the sticker seems to suggest that the chickens were perfectly fine with it. These companies think we're stupid, and they're right, given how willing people are to uncritically accept this kind of stuff and these ridiculous labels without even a hint of skepticism that maybe, just maybe, companies that are dedicated to producing as much animal flesh for as cheaply as possible might just allow animal welfare standards to slip by the side. So, why is it that so many of my atheist colleagues don't bring this up? I mean, the problem of evil for God's existence is made 1,000 times worse when you consider the plight of animals. Why don't I spend a lot of time thinking, why don't more of my atheist colleagues talk about this? Why is it only us? And I think it's because, for a lot of them, if they were to point to the heavens and say, how can you call yourself a good God while allowing so many animals to suffer? The heavens could point right back and say, well, how can you call yourself a moral person and continue to pay for these animals to suffer? That's why they're not talking about it. This can really help. This can really help our case. I also campaign for the secularization of the United Kingdom. Secularism isn't just good for the human animal. It's not just good for protecting the rights of religious minorities and atheists to live as they please. In the United Kingdom, it's a legal requirement to stun animals before you kill them. Now, this shouldn't cheer you up, by the way, because the stunning can take the form of, for instance, a gas chamber, which is considered by the government to be a form of stunning and killing at the same time, in a case of, can I really say, killing 2 birds with 1 stone? There, I've said it now. that's what they consider to be the justification. It's a legal requirement to stun animals before you kill them. That is, unless you're killing the animal in a religious slaughter. Right? You get an exemption from that legal requirement, that basic legal requirement. One of the requirements stated in the UK government to slaughter, say, animals for halal meat is that the person doing the slaughtering must be a Muslim. Similarly, if you want to do Jewish ritual slaughter, legally you have to be Jewish. What does this mean? It means that if I walk into an abattoir and I slit a cow's throat without stunning it and watch it bleed out on the floor, I've committed a criminal offense. But if I convert to Islam first, or convert to Judaism and go and do the same thing to the same animal, now it's legally A-OK. So why aren't more of them talking about it? If you've seen people like Sam Harris flop around like a fish out of water when asked about veganism because he just can't bring himself to say anything of worth without admitting that his own moral theory obliges him to veganism. Richard Dawkins, for what it's worth, at least recognizes what he perceives to be as a moral hypocrisy. But imagine if on any other subject, imagine if we were talking about anything from petty theft to abduction, and somebody said, not just that they think it's permissible, but they recognize it's impermissible, but I guess I'm just a hypocrite. We wouldn't accept this line of thought from any other kind of ethical thinking. I mean, we can't seriously pretend that people as intelligent as Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, pick your public intellectual, don't know the problem exists and don't know how serious it is. Of course they do. They have to be simply ignoring it. So if you're wondering why certain public intellectuals refuse to breathe a word about veganism despite being constantly asked to, I think it's worth reflecting on a line from Jonathan Safran Foer's wonderful book on eating animals. He writes that it's always possible to wake someone from sleeping, but it's impossible to wake somebody who is pretending to be asleep. George Orwell, in an essay called My Country, Right or Left, writes about World War I, and which he lived through, right? And he rather bluntly states that although after the war was finished, he and other people looked back upon it with as if it was one of the greatest tragedies to ever befall humanity, just an obvious, horrendous, terrible course of events. He writes that while he was living through the war, no particular event, no particular battle particularly moved him, right? Yeah, sure, it was bad, but it wasn't tragic in the way that it is when we look back. He said that it's only retrospectively, once the war was over, that you look back and see everything as it was for a whole, that you recognize the obscene tragedy of the situation. The exploitation of animals will be viewed in the same way. If you're confused, as I once was, about why everybody around you seems to be participating in an obvious evil, Christopher Browning famously observed that it was ordinary men who were guarding Auschwitz. And whilst there may be genuine malice at the top of these industries, I think that these industries of animal exploitation are mostly buttressed by ordinary people. Future historians are looking back upon us now and seeing this as the defining ethical question of our time, as I think they will obviously do. Then those eyes of history will be counting you either among the oppressors or the liberators, as Peter Singer wrote. And you've got to make that choice. When history looks back, you're going to be put in one of those two camps. Which do you want it to be? And I'm so glad to see so many people here today, obviously on the right side of that particular question. It's wonderful. It is an immense task that we have ahead of us. Right? We are asking, for the first time in human history, for a moral revolution for the sake of those who can't speak for themselves. Okay, never before in human history, ever, has there been a moral revolution in which the victims of the injustice couldn't make their own case for their liberation and had to wait on and rely upon their oppressors to make the case for them. It's a pretty horrible situation we're in, and although this makes it so much more difficult, I think it makes it all the more proud and defining as well, because this movement, I believe, is the first evidence that mankind is capable of procuring justice against the oppressed, even when it was never directly asked for by the victims themselves. Mankind has stretched his moral arm outside of himself to embrace those who've been silently suffering, to prove that justice can come about not as a result of social pressure from the victims of injustice, but from a genuine concern at all levels of society about what is simply right. This ladies and gentlemen, is what distinguishes true justice from mere self-interest. It's a willingness to fight against injustice, even if we're not the ones who suffer from it.